It's past midnight, and you can't sleep. There's one tooth right at the back of your jaw, and it's started to throb. With every heartbeat, it pulses a little harder. There's no pharmacy, no dentist to call in the morning, because there are no dentists. There isn't even a word yet for what's happening inside your mouth. There's just you, the dark, and a pain that will not stop. Now hold that feeling and stretch it backward through time. That same ache was felt by farmers in the first villages on Earth, by hunters who watched mammoths cross the horizon, by people who weren't quite people in caves across Ice Age Europe. And here's the strange part, the part it took archaeologists a long time to take seriously. Almost every one of them tried to do something about it. We like to assume that before modern medicine, our ancestors just suffered, that a toothache was something you put up with until the tooth rotted out or the infection killed you. The truth is stranger and a lot more human. Long before anesthesia, before antibiotics, before anyone could write the word for pain, people were drilling, packing, scraping, and medicating their own teeth. The real question is how far back that goes. And the answer keeps moving. Every time researchers think they found the first dentist, something older turns up. By the end of this, we'll be standing almost 2 million years in the past, looking at a behavior that might be older than our species itself. But to deal with pain, you first have to explain it. So let's start with the first explanation anyone bothered to write down. For most of recorded history, people agreed on what caused a toothache. A worm. Not a metaphor, an actual worm. Living inside the tooth, burrowing through it, chewing at the root. This was the standard medical theory for thousands of years, and it shows up almost everywhere humans kept records. The oldest written version comes from ancient Mesopotamia, in what's now Iraq, a Babylonian clay tablet sometimes called the Legend of the Worm. It tells a tiny creation story. The sky makes the earth makes the rivers make the marsh, and the marsh makes the worm. Then the worm crawls before the gods and asks what it'll be given to eat. The answer it wants is the one that would horrify any dentist. It asks to live between the teeth and the gums, where it can drink the blood of the teeth and feed on what's rotting there. Read that and you realize something. These people were describing real symptoms with unsettling accuracy. The throbbing, the bleeding gums, that feeling of something eating you from the inside. They had the experience exactly right. They just have the cause completely wrong. And here's why the worm made sense. A cavity really does look like the work of something boring through solid material, the same way a woodworm tunnels through a wooden beam. And when a rotten tooth got pulled, the soft pulp at the center could be mistaken for a small, pale worm. The theory fit what people could actually see. The treatments followed the theory. In Mesopotamia, one approach was to fumigate the tooth with a smoke of burning henbane seeds. Now, henbane is a poisonous plant with narcotic properties, which means the smoke did two useful things at once. It dulled the pain, and, as the seeds burned, their scorched husks curled into little shapes that looked, to a hopeful eye, like dead worms drifting out of the mouth. The patient felt better and watched the enemy die. There had never been a worm. This belief didn't stay in one place, and it didn't fade quickly. The toothworm turns up in Egyptian medicine, in Chinese texts, in the writings of Greek and Roman physicians. It survived in Europe well into the 1700s, long after we had microscopes that should have killed the idea off. For most of human history, this was the front line against tooth pain, a wrong idea treated with real drugs by people doing their best with what they understood. But the worm legend is written down, and writing is recent. The first cuneiform tablets are only about 5,000 years old. Tooth pain is much, much older than that, which leaves the question writing can't answer. What were people doing about their teeth before anyone could record a single word of it? To find out, you have to put down the tablets and start digging. In the 1980s and 90s, archaeologists were working through a graveyard at a place called Mehrgarh in what's now Pakistan, near the edge of the Indus Valley. It's one of the oldest farming settlements anyone has ever found, occupied for thousands of years. They had hundreds of skeletons to examine, and somewhere in that pile of teeth, somebody noticed holes. Not cavities, holes. Small, neat, round holes bored into the chewing surface of the back molars. 11 of them across 9 different adults. And when researchers looked closer, they saw something that ruled out an accident. The walls of the holes had tiny concentric ridges running around the inside, the kind of mark left by a spinning point. These teeth had been drilled. The dating put them between 7,500 and 9,000 years old. That pushed the start of dentistry back by thousands of years in a single discovery. But the detail that stops you is what it must have felt like. The wear inside the hole shows these people kept chewing for years afterward. The drilling was done on the living. So how do you drill a tooth 9,000 years before electricity? You use the tool you already have. The people of Mehrgarh were skilled bead makers. They drilled hard stones like turquoise using a tiny flint point mounted on a thin rod, spun fast with a bowstring, the same back and forth motion you use to start a fire. And when modern researchers built a copy of that drill and tried it on human enamel, it cut a hole almost identical to the ancient ones, in under a minute. Under a minute is fast. It's also a very long time when the drill is inside your mouth and nothing in the world will numb it. And this wasn't a one-off. The same practice shows up across roughly 15 centuries at the same site. Someone was learning it, doing it, passing it on. For 1,000 years and more, Mehrgarh had something close to a dental tradition. There's a clue here about why it started, and it points a finger that this whole story keeps coming back to. The teeth at Mehrgarh were in rough shape, and the likely reason was the food. These were early farmers grinding grain on stone. Tiny bits of grit from the grinding stone ended up in the flour, and every meal sanded the teeth down a little more. Once the hard outer enamel wore through and the soft layer underneath was exposed, decay and infection had a way in. In other words, the diet was creating the problem, and the drill was the response. Hold on to that, because it's going to matter a lot later. The drill removes rot. What it doesn't do is comfort anything. Boring a hole into an aching tooth might stop decay from spreading, but it's hard to call it pain relief. For that, you'd want to find someone doing the opposite, not opening the tooth up, sealing it, filling it, trying to make the pain stop rather than just cutting the damage out. And someone was. In a museum in Trieste, Italy, there's a piece of a human jaw. It sat in storage for over a century before anyone noticed what was on it. It came from a cave near Lonce in Slovenia, and it belonged to a man who lived around 6,500 years ago. One of his canine teeth had a long vertical crack running down it, and the surface was worn down enough to expose the sensitive layer beneath the enamel. Anyone who's had a cracked tooth or exposed dentine knows that particular misery. Cold water, a breath of cold air, the wrong bite, and a jolt goes straight through your whole head. When scientists scanned the tooth with high-powered imaging, they found the crack and the worn surface had been filled. The material was beeswax, and the timing of it, worked out by radiocarbon dating the wax itself, lined up with when the man was alive. This is a different kind of act than drilling. Nobody filled that crack to dig out decay. The wax did one job. It covered the raw, sensitive parts of the tooth, so that chewing and cold didn't send pain shooting through the jaw. It's the oldest direct evidence we have of dental work aimed purely at comfort. Somebody, possibly the man himself, looked at a painful tooth and reached for something soft and protective to seal it. That's not survival. That's care. And it tells you the instinct we're tracking isn't only about fixing damage. It's about wanting the hurting to stop, which is one of the most basic things a person can feel. But notice what every example so far has in common. Mehergar, farmers, Lonche, the late Stone Age, after farming had spread across Europe. We keep finding this behavior inside settled agricultural worlds, which makes it tempting to assume dentistry is something civilization invented, once it had villages and grain and time to spare. That assumption is about to fall apart. Because if you go back before the first farm, before anyone planted a single seed, the teeth are still being worked on. Go back to a time before agriculture exists anywhere on Earth. No villages, no fields, no grain. People live by hunting and gathering, moving with the seasons, in a colder, wilder world. By every assumption we just built, this is too early for dentistry. There's no settled life, no tradition being passed down in one place. There shouldn't be a dentist here. There is. At a rock shelter called Reparo Fredian in the mountains of northern Tuscany, researchers studied two front teeth. They belonged to a single person who lived between roughly 13,000 and 12,740 years ago. A hunter-gatherer, thousands of years before the first farms. Both upper incisors had large holes, and those holes ran all the way down into the pulp chamber, the soft, living core at the center of the tooth. That's the worst place for damage to reach, because that's where the nerves are. When they examined the inside of those holes under a microscope, they found horizontal scratch marks circling the walls, not natural wear. The marks of a pointed tool, scraping and twisting, deliberately enlarging the cavity and digging out the diseased tissue inside. Then came the part that made people look twice. Stuck to the inner walls of both teeth, there was a dark residue. Chemical analysis identified it as bitumen, a naturally occurring tar, and mixed into it were plant fibers and what looked like tiny hairs. This was a filling. Someone scraped out 2 rotting incisors with a stone tool, then packed the cavities with tar and plant material, possibly to keep food out of the exposed nerve, possibly because the bitumen worked as a crude antiseptic. A nearby site pushes it back even further. A person from Villabruna, around 14,000 years ago, had a cavity that was scraped clean but never filled. Slightly earlier in time, slightly simpler in technique. The same basic instinct. Open the tooth, clean out the rot. So dentistry is older than farming. That single fact rearranges the whole story. It means you don't need cities. You don't need written language. You don't need a settled economy to invent dental work. You just need teeth that hurt, and a brain that refuses to leave it alone. Which forces a new question. If these Ice Age people weren't eating farmed grain, what was rotting their teeth at all? Part of the answer is that diets were already shifting. New foods were spreading across Europe at the end of the Ice Age, some of them sweeter and more cavity-friendly than what came before. The decay was creeping up, even among hunters, and at least some of them were responding with the point of a stone tool. That's the floor we were standing on. Now watch it drop one more time. Because the next person in this story wasn't even one of us. In a cave called El Cedron in northern Spain, researchers recovered the remains of Neanderthals, a separate human species that lived alongside our ancestors and then vanished. One of them, a young male, had been sick. His jawbone shows the scar of a dental abscess, the kind of deep infection that can radiate pain through your entire skull. His dental plaque held traces of an intestinal parasite that causes severe diarrhea. He was not having a good year. Then they sequenced the DNA trapped in the hardened plaque on his teeth, and they found what he'd been putting in his mouth. Poplar. He had been chewing poplar, a tree that isn't food and isn't pleasant, but does contain salicylic acid. That's the active ingredient in aspirin, the exact compound we still reach for to take down pain and inflammation. A creature with an abscessed tooth was consuming a natural painkiller that targeted precisely what was wrong with him. And there was more. His plaque also carried traces of penicillium, the mold that gave us the first antibiotic. Now, researchers are careful here, and so should we be. There's no proof he understood that mold could fight infection, and the poplar is the stronger case. But the poplar alone is remarkable. A Neanderthal, tens of thousands of years before anyone synthesized a single drug, self-medicating tooth pain with the raw form of aspirin. And he wasn't alone among his kind. At another site, a Neanderthal with gum disease left scratch marks on the sides of the teeth, the signature of a toothpick, worked into a sore gap again and again to relieve the ache. A toothpick, such a small, ordinary thing. And that's the thread that takes us all the way down. Those same toothpick grooves, tiny channels worn at the base of the teeth by something poked between them over and over, have been found on hominin teeth going back 1.84 million years. One of the oldest belongs to Homo erectus, an ancestor far older than Neanderthals, far older than us. And here's the detail that lands. This grooving shows up only on the teeth of our genus, Homo, not on other apes, not on more distant relatives, just on us and the humans who came before us. Something about being human, all the way back to the beginning, includes worrying at a sore tooth and reaching for a tool to make it stop. So look how far we've fallen, from a midnight toothache to a worm legend, to a 9,000-year-old drill, to a beeswax filling, to Ice Age tar, to a Neanderthal taking aspirin, to a groove worn into a tooth almost 2 million years ago. The instinct keeps getting older. Which leaves one question that turns the whole story on its head. If we've been fighting tooth pain for that long, why do human teeth seem to get worse over time, not better? Here's the answer, and it's not the one you'd expect. For most of the time humans have existed, our teeth were fine. The serious trouble started when we got comfortable. If you compare the mouths of hunter-gatherers with the farmers who came after them, the hunters usually win. Fewer cavities, less decay, healthier gums. People living on wild game, roots, nuts, and whatever the season offered tended to keep their teeth in decent shape. The diet was tough and varied, and it didn't bathe the mouth in the kind of fuel that decay feeds on. Then we invented farming, and we changed the deal. Two things happened at once. First, grinding grain on stone, the same practice we saw at Mehrgar, filled the flour with grit, and that grit wore teeth down to the soft, vulnerable core. Second, and worse over the long run, agriculture flooded the human diet with starches and sugars. The bacteria that live in every mouth feed on exactly those carbohydrates, and as they feed, they produce acid, and that acid eats holes in enamel. We handed the bacteria a permanent feast. Now, farming is the foundation of basically everything we call civilization. Cities, writing, art, the population numbers that let our species cover the planet. None of it happens without a reliable food supply. And the same shift that made all of that possible is the shift that filled human mouths with rot. We didn't conquer tooth decay on the way up. We manufactured it. That's the paradox sitting under this entire story. The drilling at Mehrgar, the worm legends in the first cities, the slow grind of dental disease through recorded history. A lot of it traces back to a trade our ancestors made without knowing the cost. They bought civilization, and part of the price was paid in teeth. We've spent the thousands of years since then trying to claw back what we gave up. The bow drill, the beeswax, the bitumen, the smoke of burning henbane. Every clinic and filling and root canal that followed. All of it is humanity cleaning up a mess that humanity made. The pain came from progress. The dentistry came from chasing the pain. Step back and look at the whole span at once. A Homo erectus almost 2 million years ago, working a sliver of bone or grass into a sore gap between two teeth, over and over until it wore a tiny channel into the enamel. A Neanderthal with a swollen jaw, chewing bitter poplar bark because some part of him had learned it dulled the ache. A hunter at the end of the Ice Age, holding still while someone scraped out a rotten incisor with a stone point and packed it with tar. A Stone Age farmer, pressing warm beeswax into a cracked tooth so the cold would stop hurting. A Sumerian, breathing narcotic smoke, watching for the worm to die. Different species, different continents, tens of thousands of years between them, sometimes hundreds of thousands. Not one of them could have explained what was actually wrong inside their mouth. The worm was a myth. The mold was a guess. Half of what they tried was built on ideas we now know were wrong. And every single one of them did the same essential thing. They refused to just lie there and take it. That's what the toothpick groove really is. It's not impressive technology. It's the opposite. It's the smallest possible gesture, the most ordinary object, worn into ancient bone by a person you'll never know, who decided that the pain was not acceptable and reached for something to fix it. That decision is so old, it predates farming, predates language, predates our species. It might be one of the oldest human acts we can still see. So the next time a tooth starts to throb in the dark and you reach for a painkiller or pick up the phone to call a dentist, notice what you're doing. You're not starting something. You're continuing it. You're the latest person in a line almost 2 million years long. All of them lying awake with the same ache. All of them deciding the same thing. The tools got better. The ache stayed exactly the same. And the urge to make it stop turns out to be one of the most human things about us.